Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Black Men with Purpose podcast. For those of you joining us for the first time, it's a pleasure to have you with us. This is a safe space where we share our thoughts on a multitude of topics in hopes of helping Black males, young and not so young, overcome obstacles and challenges that can be hindrances to happiness, productivity, and success. We believe that through our experiences, successes, and failures, we can have some conversations that might help other Black males in their respective journeys through this thing we call life. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the prison industrial complex, or PIC, the acronym is known as. Before we jump into it, though, I want to start by kind of saying two things. First, for me personally, while I am absolutely a prison abolitionist, this is one of the few, maybe the only topic that I really don't have many original thoughts on, quite frankly. I stand on the shoulders of, and I'm in total agreement with the thoughts of people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Mariam Mukaba, Angela Davis, Derek Purnell, Asada Shakur, and others. They've done all the work, and I see myself as just kind of a conduit or a funnel, if you will, someone who wholeheartedly believes in prison abolition and wants to see the world reimagined. The second thing I'll say is more of a question than it is a statement. Much of what is promulgated regarding prison abolitionists is what we don't want, where we don't want funding to go, etc. I want to pose this question for you to consider as we kind of talk through this topic. And that question is, what would the world look like for you if all of your needs were met? Or what would the world look like for all of us if we could meet each other's collective needs? And so with that, we'll kind of jump into some of these questions that we're using to frame this whole discussion. And the first thing is really to define what the prison industrial complex is. And I took this definition from an organization that I follow who are huge in the prison abolition movement, and they're called Critical Resistance. And their definition of the prison industrial complex is that it's a term we use to describe the overlapping interest of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. So again, that's a it's all encompassing, but it's also short. Complex. Any of you other brothers want to, interject anything before we continue on?
I knew coming into this conversation, I am a diehard prison abolitionist. And a lot of, the information I'll share, this isn't something I came to on my own, but it was, and we were going to get into it. I think that's one of the topics, but I just kind of wanted to say that we have to reimagine this. Like, I think a lot of time we get stuck and we say, well, prisons and police are the only way we can do it. We have to kind of go back to that root and rethink it from there, because that's why the system exists the way it does. Is because we've been told that police are the only way and prisons are the only way. And the crazy part is, and I'm probably getting all into the show already, but the crazy part is as somebody who's lived in a low income, dangerous, high crime area, and someone who's lived in a high rent district, high tax district, I recognize, like, the people around here, like, we have a private parking garage, and when people park in there too long, they don't even want the tow truck to come and tow cars away, because they don't want to feel like how that looks when other people see that you live in a neighborhood where they tow cars. So people are able to get away with stuff because of this kind of neighborhood. They don't want the cops all the way always around. They don't want all that. They don't want. And so it makes you realize that it's not so much the presence of police. And then, man, when you get into that prison thing, just cash bail, all of the inequities, man, you get to talking about Rikers, which isn't it's a holding jail, and people go over there and spend years in Rikers and never get, like, it's just so much to it. So those are my thoughts on it. Just to kind of intro it. But, the prison industrial complex, it kind of spreaded its wings out of the military industrial complex. And then it just became a movement where political power and a lot of money was made through the privatization of jails. And because it became a for-profit thing, it started to become a lobbying to make this this kind of crime and that kind of crime and who has to do the time and what are the rules, because we are very aware that slavery was abolished with the exception of being imprisoned. And so, you know, when you think about the numbers and you think about in the United States, we have more people imprisoned by a large number than any other country in the world, you know. So there's a lot of conversation when you talk about this.
But to that last point you just made, John, you know, the United States makes up about 5% of the world population. However, we house over 25% of the world's prison population. So that is, and I'll state that again because I think that's huge, and it speaks a lot to what we're going to be discussing in this episode. United States makes up about 5% of the world's population. However, we have 25% of the world's prison population. Right? There's something wrong with that. Something wrong with that. Sorry, B, if I cut you off.
It's okay. It's cool. No, and it just goes back to the economics. I mean, when it's all said and done, everything is being privatized. When you think about when we first came in the military, it wasn't no contractor cutting grass. It was airmen that was cutting grass.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so now states are like, well, I don't have to pay a salary to a guard. I don't have to pay a retirement to a guard. I don't have to pay health insurance for a guard. Let's privatize it, and we just pay that flat fee, and we're done with it. So I think when you start looking at the root cause, I mean, we can go on as education, but definitely the economic impact, that's the root cause. Long story short, look at the government contracts. Is more contractors out there. I mean, right now you can go into sam.gov. There's almost 100,000 contracts that the federal government is trying to outsource to people. So at the end of the day, it's the economic impact, and of course, who carries the brunt of that? Poor folks. So
absolutely,
or people who don't have. And I know we're gonna get into it, but when you look at the numbers, like you said, Kevin, 25% of the world's population is in prison. And who's in there? Brown and black folks make up almost 60% of everybody who's incarcerated.
Yep.
It's all about the economics, and I'm looking at some documentation. I was able to print out. My printer crapped out on me today, but some of the numbers I was looking at, Kevin, you talked about it. Around 5% of the U.S. Having of the global population. And at the time this was done was in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, and it was saying at that point in time that the U.S. held over almost 20% of the total global population, and like you said, it's up to 25% now. And one of the things I did see is that, you know, again, this is from 2020 information, but it was basically talking about how, you know, stuff really started with the war on drugs, and that you know, at the time that this article was written, black men had been admitted to state prisons on drug charges at a rate that was more than 13 times higher than white men. And again, that was in 2020, so you know it's only increased since that time. The ACLU actually had put down that, you know, out of every 3 black boys today could expect to go to prison. You know, that was again 2020. We know that number has increased. And at that time, they said they could a Latino, it was 1 out of every 6 compared to 1 out of every 17 white men. You know, so again, it has become I believe there is a need for prisons, but my personal feeling is that they should be state run or government run and not owned by not privatized, because, you know, that's strictly for profit, and that's what people are. They're fighting to keep people from who have served their time from being able to get out and try and get back to having a normal life. They're trying to keep them in, because if they get paroled, that there goes some of the people, the folks' money that owns these private prisons.
So the second thing we want to kind of discuss is how we got here, right? And for me, I see it as going way back, right? And you know, for the most part, I think the history of prisons and policing in the U.S. is it's kind of layered. But in terms of understanding how we arrived at this current moment, and I'll give kind of an abridged version of this. The history of prisons, both, you know, when we're talking about literal buildings as well as, a cultural concept, was kind of brought here by the Puritans, right? Who colonized the Northeast. They used prisons as a punishment for members of their own community who wouldn't adhere to, the strict religious lifestyle, which were the Pilgrims, right? The Pilgrims kind of were derived from the Puritans. They were ones who kind of, defied the Puritan, religious lifestyle and did some different things. And so Puritans used prisons as a punishment for them in order to make an example of them in service of kind of a harsh moral code. They also used it to imprison the local indigenous people who they were in conflict with, obviously. And I say conflict when we all know what actually that was. It wasn't a conflict. It was them colonizing is what it was. But prisons weren't even originally married to the police force, right? Police forces, as we know them today, kind of grew out of these ad hoc militia and mercenaries who were formed to hunt down fugitive enslaved Africans, right, and then capture them for reward and send them back to their owners. And while that's somewhat of an oversimplification, that's kind of where the root of the carceral system comes from, right? And it's kind of inextricably linked to Christian theocracy, colonization, and slavery, right? And so with that explanation, we can also see that it had nothing to do. It was not formed to kind of keep communities safe or protect the community at all. That's not what it was designed for, prisons or policing. Later reforms kind of to the system, made some things a little bit different. However, that was kind of where it was based in. So, and we'll get into the whole reform versus abolition thing, but that's just it. Like, it was based in punishment, based in colonization, based in slavery, all these things. It was never meant to be what it has become, but that was the foundation of it.
Man, Kev knocked that one out the park. We saw these constructs come because of different religious, ethical, and racial opinions and everything. But then the boom really in the and we'll talk about this when we talk about reimagining what a justice system should look like. But when you look at things like mandatory minimums and the criminalization of drugs, whereas if it's crack cocaine, it's a sentence like this, and if it's powder, it's a different sentence. And then you look at like this idea that prison and the police, like, I think people get all stuck, like, hey, being a policeman and a cop and a sheriff, that's an honorable gig. We ain't saying it's not at all. But what we're saying is, I actually have a view that is very, man, forget it. Let's go for it right here. We keep talking about, oh yeah, man, they're going to do martial law and they're going to have the National Guard out on the streets. I'm like, they don't have to. Look how they militarizing the police already. The National Guard is already in police stations near you. You know what I'm saying? Like, they militarize them and they deploy them how they need whenever they want to. And, when you talk about how we got here, it's the inequities. You look at judges, white judges that look at white children and think they shouldn't go to jail because they have a future in front of them. And then those same judges will look at black and brown people and think we need to throw the book at them, teach them a lesson. They a menace. Man, you heard Clinton and Biden especially using that language, talking about super predators and all that. So we get here because they come up with something. They really, man, you hate to always, and I love what Kev said, is like, maybe it's an oversimplification, but that's what time we on, to make it as simple as possible. But when you look at it, it is capitalism fueled by elitism and race, using racism as a tool to get there. And, they use some more other isms to do it, but It's a bunch of greedy folks, and they're able to create narratives, and they're able to empower institutions and do all of these things. And that's a big part of how we got here. Like, we just think it's normal for people to rot away in jail. Like, we don't even think about how, mandatory minimums. You're quick to say, oh man, you do that, that's 5 to 10. But if you look in other societies, like, that's ridiculous that for some of this stuff that's just mandatory, 5 to 10 years of your life gone in terrible conditions at that, so
you started to go there when we started talking about the legal system, about the judges and the prosecutors and how they don't look like us. So, my thing is, hey, some of this is because we don't vote in our local elections like we should. We get all excited about the presidential, but we don't vote for our local folks that help us regulate these laws that's going to benefit people that look like us. But I don't want to get too down that rabbit hole. But I mean, for how do we get here between not voting, and it's just the cost. When you look at on average, I mean, I was doing research. So we spend about $870 billion a year on our education system. So our secondary education system, we spend about almost $300 billion on the prison system. So you might say, well, that's, the disparity is, we're spending more money on education. But when you break it down per student in education, we only spend about $18,000 a year on education. But a prisoner, we spend over $135,000 a year in the prison system. I'm like, to me, if we spent more time, we're going to get into the numbers about the education of people in the prison system, but that's got to be a start. Why are we spending so much money on prisoners and we're not preventing them from being prisoners because we're not spending enough in the education system? So I'm like John, I don't want to get in the rabbit hole, but that just blows my mind that we're spending 6-8 times more per person in prison than we are in our education system. And then on top of that, we don't pay our teachers enough to be in the education system with our students, with our children, to help them prepare to prevent them from even being in the legal system. So, so to me, it's just, we got the money back. We got the money backwards. And so what they say, when they get ready to prosecute somebody, when the FBI, when they show up at your house, they've already done the money trail. They showed up at your house because they know where the money is. So for prison reform, where does the money go?
It's not about the reform. I mean, what you just, the numbers you just threw out, Byron, they're incredible. Again, the profit is for these people that own these private prisons. They're not going to see any of the money if the money is getting spent in the education system, but they're going to see a lot of it, or a good chunk of it, by having these prisoners locked up in these private prisons. That's exactly why they're not worrying about, or they're taking the money. They're not even doing anything for the public education system. They're taking the money and opening these charter schools where everybody can't get into them. The majority of the kids go to these public schools. They can't get into these charter schools. The elitists are getting into these charter schools. But that's what they're worrying about putting their money at, is for the kids that they can select it to get into these schools, versus taking care of the masses, which would be the public school system. So of course, to me, that's why you can follow the money right to the prison system, because the people that own those prisons, that's who's reaping the benefits of that money.
What does abolition even mean? In an extreme literal sense, abolition really refers to the complete dismantling of, rather than reforming or improving, the carceral system in the United States, which includes state prisons, private prisons, which obviously profit from incarceration. And I don't want to get too wrapped around the axle in this thing on private prisons either, because it's a fact that private prisons aren't the only ones profiting from incarceration. State-run prisons have, capitalism plays a huge role in state prisons as well. So it's not just about private prisons. And I don't want to get too wrapped around the axle on that and make it seem like they're the only ones who are the problem or who are profiting from this, because that's just flat out not the truth. But as far as abolition, again, it's about doing away with all of these systems in a literal sense. That's really what it is, and I guess in a more concrete sense, it's about prisons, the buildings themselves, as well as the reality of caging human beings would no longer exist, right? Police forces as an enforcer of the law, in the name of state would no longer exist. That's really what it's about. So, and we'll jump more into all of this, again, too, not only as you all have things to say, but when we get into the next question about reform versus abolition and all those things as well.
But what does abolition mean? And I think that's an important question to ask, because, the terms, man, like, when we were talking about defund the police and reinvest that money, people got all wrapped up in defund. So they thought that meant get rid of. But no, man, it's way too much money being spent on police to buy stuff they don't need, to militarize them, to pay for. City of Chicago last year spent $500 million in lawsuits against cops for police brutality because they have immunity. So you can't directly sue a cop. You got to sue the city. And the city paid out almost $500 million, dollars in cases against the police because they can just get away with doing whatever. And obviously we know who's paying for that. And, when you talk about abolition, we got to make sure that we don't over radicalize that word, because that doesn't mean that there won't be some type of punishment. But, when you talk about abolition, you talk about getting rid of things like mandatory minimums. You talk about putting money into preventative programs, because the reality is this idea that crime is happening because people are just evil and sitting around. It's a 10, 10, 80. So there's 10% of people that are just salt of the earth and always do good, fall in that scale of the 80 that, they just depend on the circumstances. They could be closer to the good, closer to the bad. And then there's 10% of people that are just mean-hearted, evil people. And when you look at it as if these people in these communities are just crime informed type people that would shoot and rob and do all the things that they do if the conditions weren't the way that they are, And then you look at the conditions were intentionally created that way. Like, we call them projects. That is the real term for it. It is a housing project. If you look on the cornerstone of one of these buildings, I remember I went back to where my aunt used to stay, a project in San Antonio, and I couldn't believe what I was looking at. It's written, this is the New Light Village housing project. And it was founded by the city of San Antonio, and it just had all this other stuff. And I'm like, man, they just playing with us in our face. Like, it's just right here in plain sight. So when you talk about prison abolition, what does it mean? It means having a more balanced view towards it. It means not spending all of our money on more prisons, on keeping people in prison, on a system that benefits such a small amount of people and destroys communities and families. And it's just a better way. And there's, like Kev said when we started, it takes creativity just to reimagine it. Let's not believe that, oh, well, you got caught with 2 grams of marijuana, so you got to do 5 to 10 years. Like, it's just a ridiculous concept.
John, I'm sorry, Ray and B, if y'all were about to jump in, but I think one of the huge problems with prison abolition and the way people just kind of dismiss it when they hear anything about prison abolition, it's because they see it as just simply doing away with prisons. That's it. That's what they think prison abolition is. That's not what prison abolition is. It's about eliminating the root cause of harm. It's about eliminating a society that could rely on police to resolve that harm, right? It's about reimagining a world where interpersonal harm, economic need, social health vulnerability, all these things are a thing of the past and no longer exist. It's not simply about, okay, let's close all the prisons, let's just fire all the police right now. That's prison. No, that is not what prison abolition is. Again, it's about eliminating the root cause. It's about putting money where money is supposed to be, in healthcare, in jobs, in all these different things, in education, right? So it would be an incremental thing. It's not close all the prisons today. We know that that's not feasible, right? That's not what it's about. It's about creating a world, again, where you eliminate the root cause of harm, the cause for anybody to. We know that the safest communities aren't the ones that are most policed. They're the ones that have the most resources. So if you put resources where resources need to be, which is not in the police departments, well, then you can start to undo, right, some of these things that have caused crime and things like that to even occur. So once again, it's not simply about doing away. It's not about the absence of police or prisons. Yes, that's part of it, without a doubt. But in order to get there, you have to work on eliminating the root cause of harm and why people are going to prison to begin with.
Yeah. And here in Prince George's County, I talked to a police officer about 6 months ago because PG was one of the, actually was, when we talk about, where everybody was talking about defunding the police, they weren't trying to do away with the police department, but they took about $20 million, $25 million from the police budget and actually put it towards mental health. So now they actually have a mental health expert or subject matter expert that goes on the calls with the police officers as needed in Prince George's County. And one police officer told me he didn't have a problem with that. As a matter of fact, because guess what it does for them? It relieves them to actually do actual crime solving. You know what I'm saying? If they roll up on somebody because, Pookie is having a mental crisis, Pookie don't need to go to jail for that. You know what I'm saying? But when you call the police and there's no other resources, guess what the police got to do? They got to take somebody who ain't really bothering nobody, who ain't really, just being in their own mental state and having an issue. But now you're taking the police a resource away to attend to this person who they don't really need the police for. So I know here in the county, they were like, hey, we love it. Take that money and give us the relief that we need to actually be police officers and let these people who need the support of a specialist, those that need a therapist, let's send a therapist in to talk to them. Let's send a therapist in to help them, help them through their process. And then let's build a facility where these people are not in jail, but let's build a facility that when we realize that somebody's having a mental health crisis, we can take them to a place where there's other people that can help them. No offense, but most of the police officers, unless they do have a psychology degree, most of them don't. You know what I'm saying? So they're not going to be empathetic to someone's breakdown. They're not going to be sympathetic to someone having a mental health crisis. They're going to be like, let me hurry up and get this done so I can get back on the street. And so we got to have that. We got to have communities that think like, okay, beside taking somebody to jail, what else can we do? And so, I don't want to get into a soapbox, but then when you have those communities that don't want to provide those alternatives for people who are having a crisis, then what are they left with? Oh, let's just put them in jail. They're out of our hair. They're out of community. They're not being a threat to anybody. Let's just put them in jail, and then they don't get the help that they need. So,
fortunately, in this country, we use prisons as a default asylum, essentially, right, for individuals with mental illness. Why is it that the government chooses to spend billions of dollars a year to concentrate people with serious illness, mental illness, into a system that's designed to punish intentional law breaking, right? When doing so matches neither the putative purposes of that system, nor does it most effectively address the issue posed by that specific population, right? In this country, in the United States, there are more people with mental illness in prisons than there are in psychiatric hospitals. Mm-hmm. Come on.
That means they gotta start spending more money on brown and black folks to make them better people. They don't want that. You know,
It's a problem.
pull up your own bootstraps, as they told us, right? You
Yeah.
you got your bootstraps, but it's like, how am I pull up my bootstraps when I don't have the boots?
Yeah. So I just wanted to say, Kev, you bring up a good point. But think about what imprisonment actually does to a person.
Absolutely.
Even a mentally healthy person going into
Absolutely.
that environment,
Yeah.
the isolation, the the loneliness, the violence that they're constantly around. I
Yes.
mean, it's so if you didn't have mental health challenges going in, you might develop them while you're in there.
No question.
No
question.
and then of course we do a terrible job when they are released and reintroducing them back into society where they can be productive. So it becomes cyclical in nature, and even though uh, politicians or those that are want to speak on the benefits of it would say that prison population has gone down in the US over the past 14, 15 years. But it doesn't speak to what prison does to those that are confined there, and not even to speak of the number of innocent people
Innocent. Absolutely. Yeah.
that are confined to prison.
Yeah.
And just think of what that number would look like if they had never gone to DNA as a tool,
Yeah.
a resource to help some who knew and were innocent to be released. But even with that,
Yeah.
now coming out, you spent 11 years as an example of your life locked away involuntarily for something that you always knew you didn't do.
Right.
And if there was not necessarily, proven that you did, but because I think society has become so numb to the idea of people being locked away against their will, they're willing to accept that, well, if the police say you did it, then you must be guilty. Yeah, it's a sad situation.
And recidivism exists because there aren't systems in place in prison or in society for those who are in a carceral state to even succeed, right? We're just about, okay, yep, this person did this, let's throw them in prison and not do anything to try to rehabilitate them, because it is very rare to find any sort of real rehabilitation going on in any prison. And so when you hear about these, when the news try to will put something on about something that's happening in a certain prison where they're doing Shakespeare or they're reading these books or they're doing this, that's catfishing, or whatever the term is used for, because that's the exception. It is absolutely proven to not be the rule. In most prisons, they don't do anything to rehabilitate anybody. And then they wonder why recidivism even exists, which for those who may not know, that just means someone who gets through. That's what recidivism is. And so if you're not doing anything to really rehabilitate, then what are we doing here? What are we doing?
Well, Kev, like I said to your point earlier, it's about the money. It's about the money. They're able to get more money from folks being in prison than being free out on the streets. And I believe it was Rod that mentioned the politicians. One thing about the politicians, they're not going to acknowledge that these criminalized harms are being done. And they're not, basically the folks that are the politicians are basically being paid by the folks that are able to benefit from it. So they're not going to try and do anything to address the problem. They're not going to address the systemic racism or anything else. They're trying to get paid and keep their jobs in politics.
That a couple days ago, I actually watched a clip. I'm gonna have to try and look it up so I can shoot it to you. But it was a warden who had taken over a prison and a cell block, which comprised maybe, I don't know, 50 or so prisoners within that particular area. He opened all the cells open, which I guess
saw
they
that.
do. Did you?
I watched
Yeah,
that. That was a good show. Yeah.
I saw that.
Yeah. But
True
and I guess
story.
we'll talk about reimagining, what to do. But one, now you start to at least humanize them in a way that they might not have been before, and you give them the power to determine what their experience there is actually like. I'm gonna have to go back and look at it, but I thought that it was a great story for some of you got to think outside the box when you're talking about human lives that have the ability to be rehabilitated if someone cares enough.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. You do a crime, and then all of a sudden society doesn't really care about what happens to you. And I think that's in essence what we've kind of witnessed throughout the prison system, unfortunately.
How do we reimagine law enforcement and citizen safety? I'll let someone else jump in since I've started all of them.
I'll jump in. I mean, reimagine law enforcement. Like I think we already said, we're not saying do away with the police, but let's give.
I am, because that's what police abolition actually is. But go ahead, D.
Yeah, but I'm not saying do away with the police, because you still got some folks out here that's just gonna act up, and you got to have somebody, go in and talk to these people, do something with them. But for me, I see actually giving the police the actual tools that they're going to need, not only just to do law enforcement, but actually meet the needs of the community. And what does that look like? That looks like I said earlier, it's like giving them the mental health professionals that they're going to need to help them do their job. And as far as citizen safety, same thing. Let's give these communities the resources that they need, because everything that somebody does is not a criminal offense. It's a teaching opportunity. And I was looking over this. It's almost like every now and then you'll find somebody that made it to the NBA that started playing started playing basketball as a junior or senior in high school. They made it to the NBA. But a lot of these folks started playing AAU ball, right? So they started playing early. And so for me, what we have to do, these folks who end up in prison, is because nobody helped them out when they were young. Nobody spoke life into them when they were young. Nobody said you can make it, you can do this, other than doing the things that are breaking the law. So here you find, let's give these communities the tools and resources that are necessary to make their communities a teachable community, and not just holding people as a crime. Let's do something different in these communities. Look back at I think when I was doing the research, I got to look for it, but it was something like 65-70% of prisoners can't read past the 4th grade. And so again, if we had instilled in them at an earlier age in these communities that they can read, if we spent more money and resources in their education system, maybe they would not be in the prison system. So to me, I see reimagining law enforcement is reimagining your community. What are the tools that you need to make your community not just safe, but make it a teachable moment for folks, versus punishing them for some of the mistakes they made? Because everybody's going to make mistakes. The question is, are we going to, as Rod said, are we going to rehabilitate them and give them the tools to correct themselves or correct their environment? Or are we just going to throw them in jail and not teach them anything?
Right. It absolutely is about doing away with prisons and doing away with the police, but it's not about doing it tomorrow. Everything you just said is what it would take to get to the point where police and prisons wouldn't be necessary. A lot of people think that that's some sort of utopian existence, but I would say this: when you talk about police abolition, and again, let me, before I even say that, let me say this, and I think to some degree I've already said it. Police abolition is not so much about the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of a society that could even have prisons, that could have slavery, that could have anything, that would even call for the need for it, right? So that's what it's about. And in order to get to that, what I was about to say was, a lot of people say, well, there's no way we can create that kind of society where police and prisons wouldn't be necessary. Well, I would argue that there were a lot of people who were slave abolitionists who said the same thing, right? That there'll never be a day where slavery doesn't exist, right? And maybe that's the case for police abolition. Maybe we will never get to that point. However, we have to at least work toward creating a society where we can get to that point. Again, there were people in slavery who said that same thing, and what happened, right? Eventually they got there. There were people who said women would never have rights, but guess what? Eventually we got there. So we may not see it in our time, but I think it's incumbent upon us, at least those of us who are police abolitionists, to do whatever we can to try to create that sort of society where we can get to a point where we are policing ourselves, where money is poured into education, where money is poured into healthcare, where money is poured into jobs, where we create these societies where we have people just don't need to be going out and creating and committing crimes. And yes, there might be some instances of that, and we'll talk about some of the things that maybe we can do in those instances. But yes, absolutely. Will there be people acting up, as you say? Sure, there'll be some. And there'll be some things that will be put in place in this society where police and prisons no longer exist. There'll be things in place for those people. But again, police abolition is all about doing away with prisons and police eventually. Not today, not tomorrow. But it's about creating that exact society that you were talking about to get to that point.
If you struggle with the idea of reimagining it, then I just want to challenge people to look at what they do in affluent neighborhoods. It'll give you all the clues and keys to get it started. In my neighborhood, there's a fire station close. So I hear the fire trucks often, but I don't hear police sirens often at all. And when I think about the amenities, it's not a food desert. There are lots of healthy, amazing food choices. I've got a selection of 3 to 4 high-end grocery stores within a mile of me in any direction. There are plenty of parks. There's a whole complex where they have soccer games, but it's open to the community. So me and LJ could just walk over there and walk into this complex. And there are other parks that we can go in and sit in, and there's dog walking parks. There's like 3 mathnasiums just in my community alone. There's a community center where they do summer camp and they do all of these other things. The school that LJ goes to, they're building a new school because it's overcrowded, but they have all of the programs. So they've got the autism program. They've got, programs for health careers and people that want to get into STEM and all of this. And none of this is something that you got to pay for or whatever. It's just a part of this community. And that's what people have access to. And I'm not even getting started. That's tip of the iceberg. And the cops ain't down here harassing people. The biggest thing they do is, because it's downtown, is, you get law enforcement writing parking tickets. But even they don't even bug that much. They swing through twice a day, because it's from like 7 in the morning to 8:30 at night. But when you think about all of the options, that's where you start when you talk about reimagining law enforcement and citizen safety. Before you start talking about getting rid of cops and all this, that, and the other, start making quality investments into the community, into the schools, into the community centers, into parks, into recreation, into ways that families can be able to do things that increase their mental health and their togetherness. Think about creating job options. You know what's crazy to me is I was watching this show and these people were doing hard work and they were making less than $10 an hour. And yet I have worked with some of the most, I've worked with some people that have never had never had an original idea. They get into meetings and they bloviate and all this other stuff. They be talking real loud and ain't saying nothing. But yet you can't tell them that an hour of their time ain't worth $10,000. But you got people that doing back-breaking work and you telling them that they can't even make enough an hour to go get a value meal at a fast food restaurant. So we got to reimagine this, but we've just gotten to the point where we say, well, yo, if this white dude wear a tie and a white shirt and work in the office, he should be rich. And then this dude over here that does this kind of work should be poor. And it's just the neighborhoods and their fault. And that's cap. That is a falsity, but we've bought into it the same way that we buy into the fact that I remember when I was growing up, the police would come and knock on our door and just come in and say, look, we need to search. I'm like, search for what? I've been asleep all night. What are you searching for? And they just bust in and do that and just pull you over. Like, if they're there to protect and serve, why the most nervous you get around a cop is when they pull behind you in traffic? Like, because they're abusing their power, obviously. And here, yeah, I'm getting wound up. Let me back off now. But we can reimagine it, and there's already examples of how to reimagine law enforcement and city safety.
Just in listening to John and Byron and Kevin, I think back, the whole problem stems from it all being cyclical in nature. When you think about the challenges that we have and the reasons that we have them, something has gone awry. I mean, you think back to the crack epidemic. Where the folks in those communities, they were consumers, but they weren't the ones that were necessarily making it and bringing it into the communities. And when you think about the crime, I mean, there are a lot of people in the country that we don't even know they're here because they've entered illegally. We don't have processes in place to solve. Just think about just that simple problem and what a solution might look like. Because you can't go overrun a lot of other countries in the world just because you want to go in. So a lot of the problems I think are created because of not just our laws, but the lack of enforcement of them. And then it then creates another problem that begets another, that begets another. And then the government will print some more money. And it just continues over and over and over and over again. And I think because people feel so entitled, in this country, and we've talked about it before. I know folk that have never even had a job.
Yeah.
But they've been able to live to be real grown adults. And they wait for their check to come the first of every month. And then in between, they do who knows what to who knows who to get by until the first comes around again. And the problem just keeps repeating itself. And of course, if you're going to live in this country, you got to pay your taxes. And when you start thinking about what the tax dollars are spent on, the lack of accountability you know, because no matter where you're voting in, these politicians in the office, after the election cycle, who's holding them accountable? How often do you ever hear from them again? Do they
Election day.
provide you? Yeah, exactly. Do they provide you their scorecard on
Yeah.
how they're doing, keeping their promises? None of that happens, you know. So there's just a severe lack of accountability, you know, in all the systems that should matter to citizens, and it's just a vicious cycle that continues over and over again. Which is why you don't really see a lot of real progress being made. And that's the saddest part about it. You know, and looking and preparing for this topic and all, a lot of people are involved in prison reform, Project Innocence. There's a lot of those programs around. You hear about the high profile ones whenever because people in power and authority wants it to be highlighted to score points for themselves. So now we're back to selfishness being the driver behind what they even will allow out, publicized. You know, and don't get on the media. I mean, that of all the things they could be talking about, besides, you know, who got murdered. Who wants to hear that every single night? Is that really news that you need to be reporting every single night? As opposed to all the great things that might be going on that people are trying to correct. Maybe that and more of that will cause more people to get involved. So I'll stop. As you see, this soapbox can go on forever.
Why abolition instead of reform? I think, you know, many people who like the word reform for this say so because they think the system is broken, right? And saying the system is broken, one, is not true. It's working exactly as it was intended. And two, saying it's broken suggests that it actually can be reformed when it can't. They've been reforming the system forever, right? And all they do is make things worse generally when they say we're reforming it. So reform just has never worked. I have no reason to believe that it ever will. It must be completely dismantled and replaced. And it's not simply about closing police departments, right? Obviously, that's part of it. But as I have said a million times over, it's about making them obsolete. You know, putting things in place where police and prisons are just no longer ever needed again. That's what it's about. And again, people may think that's some sort of utopian, you know, state that's not, you know, doable, but I disagree. I disagree with that, right? I mean, when you think about some of the things that are in place now, right? We talk about, Byron talked about it, right? Having these trained community care workers who could, right now, they're helping out cops. Cops aren't needed at all. These trained community care workers shouldn't be helping cops. Cops shouldn't be involved at all. Trained community care workers do this job without cops, oftentimes, right? And they do so without incident. And you never hear about it because there's no incident. Usually, if there's an incident, it's because cops were involved. So it shouldn't be about these trained workers helping cops. No, trained workers should be doing the jobs and cops shouldn't be around for it, period.
So you bring it up, and I guess the question would be then, how does one deal with, you know, someone who may be mentally challenged, who might be going through a crisis themselves, who's armed, and could cause harm to themselves or others. Uh, so many examples of that. In fact, I don't know if y'all saw where and of course I heard you about cops being involved, but 10 cops got shot a week or two ago trying to answer a domestic call. Someone, I guess, was having a mental crisis. So I think if you hear one of those stories, that's enough to give people cause to try and do it differently, you know? And so I'm just interested in what you do, or what's the balance with trying to do it without police being involved when there's so many
I think
examples of violence there.
first thing I'll say is that, as I have stated probably 50 times already, the goal is to put things in place where cops aren't needed. So what that would mean is these instances that you're referring to with these domestic violence cases and mental health cases, if things are in place, if we live in a society where cops aren't needed, that means there is a huge chance that these things that you're talking about won't even exist, right? Why do these things even exist? I'm not saying mental health crisis will just dissipate all of a sudden. I'm not saying that there won't be a single case of domestic violence. We know that it's not realistic to think that this would be a perfect world if police were gone and money was funneled into every place that it needed to be. But the cases of those would be significantly reduced, because you look at why some people, if they're not born that way, you think about why some people have mental health crises. You think about why domestic violence exists and things like that, right? Generally speaking, domestic violence takes place in poverty-stricken environments, right? So this society that prison abolitionists look at, you don't have that anymore. Those things go away. So, or at least go away to a huge degree, right? And then for those instances where they do occur, that's where the creativity and the reimagining would come in, right? That's where I don't have all the answers to that, right? I'm not going to sit here and profess to, but that's where we have to think of things. But as it stands right now, what are the police doing, right? I think it's so interesting because when people who do bring up things like that, or they bring up, well, what about instances of rape or murder and things like that? And usually I will ask, well, what about all the law enforcement we have roaming the streets in this country right now? Do you actually feel safe? And the answer is generally it's reticent, but usually it's no, right? And so what we're doing now isn't solving the problem. So why shouldn't we think of some other ways to try to solve these problems? Because again, as it's working as it is right now, that the system just is not working as it is. And I don't know if that exactly answers your question. I hope that it does, you know. But then I look at in 22, it was discovered that, and this is along those same lines of policing, but it was discovered that from a federal database that the system failed to count for more than half of the deaths from police violence over nearly 40 years, right? And what? Blacks were killed at a rate of nearly 3.5 the rate of white people in those instances. So things like that, right? It says that police reform is just simply not enough, and policing is not truly working. So again, I don't know if that totally answers your question, but answers your question, but
Yeah, no, I mean, I get it, but I think that it points to what the challenge is in so many areas. Pick an
yes,
area,
absolutely.
you know, and we talked about in the past, as we continue to, about the corrupt systems that are in place
Yes,
that
yes.
you can't overcome. And so just think, you know, I think about it from an economic perspective, that if you didn't have some of these things, Now, not only do you reimagine that, or the next thing, now you reimagine how people earn a living, right? Because you don't need, the heavy-handed arm or hand of law enforcement anymore. But who's putting the drugs on the streets, right? Countries had an opioid epidemic for how long? That's not necessarily relegated to people of color or low-income communities, you know? So the violence that you talked about, it's not just because low-income people might be struggling, but about the wealthy people that maybe overindulge in spirits too much, that changes the makeup of how they behave. I mean, it's so many inputs to this thing that determines the output that you get. How do you change it all? And that's the challenge.
It is. It is a challenge, and no one ever said it would be easy. But is it doable? Absolutely. If we start working towards that, it's doable. But also, too, to some of your points, a lot of that is still diminished by creating the society that I've been talking about, right? I'm not
Well, I
saying
think
that
that
it
goes
goes
back
away
to
entirely,
right.
but when you start talking about what you said, you talked about people drinking, right? Why do people drink generally, right? Oftentimes, when you look at research shows why people drink. The society that we're talking about creating takes away the reason why a lot of people even drink, the reason why a lot of people do opioids, which, yes, that's not just relegated to poor people, but also it's relegated to people with pain meds and things like that. People who don't have any other way, they have to be on pain meds because they can't get surgeries and they can't do this, that, and the other. So again, I get what you're saying, and no one's saying that it's going to be easy, but also a lot of what you're saying will be addressed by a lot of the people who are on opioids won't be on opioids if they have health care, right? A lot of people who drink won't be drinking if you do things, if you put things in place to eliminate the reasons that they drink. And again, I'm not saying it goes away altogether, but it does address it.
Right. And I
At
would
least,
say, right. And I
at
would
least to
tell you,
some degree.
I'm here for whatever's gonna make this society better and a better place to try and exist in. Uh, and you're right. We need to do something different than what we've
Yeah.
done in the past. Uh, that yeah. So sign me up.
Because when you think about it right now, right, when you just think about the police, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm dominating this whole thing, and I know you all have valuable inputs. Um, when you send police in to arrest a murderer right now, right, what did that do? It didn't eliminate the murder. So then the question should be, what makes a person commit murder, and what can be done to eliminate that thing or those things, right? There's something like 16,000 people killed in the U.S. every year. Cops are supposed to solve and arrest, but the murder still occurred. However, we do know what prevents murders often: a strong economy, jobs, healthcare, education, all connected as part of a community. And absent those things, the conditions for violence exist. Conditioning can be undone, right? Capitalism, patriarchy, etc. Those are all things that have created and led to these things. So that's what abolition is all about. It's about putting these structures in place to where these murders are mostly eliminated, where all these things that you talk about, at least to a large degree, go away. And then for those that still exist, again, that's where the creativity, that's where the imagination comes in and trying to figure out how we police that. But generally speaking, if those things are in place, to John's point, John said, if you look at wealthy neighborhoods, and he's exactly right, they police their neighborhoods now, right? So if all these things are in place, pretty good chance that most communities are going to be policing themselves because it goes on right now, right? And I'll tell you right now, most prison abolitionists will tell you we don't have all the answers, right? But what we do know is that doubling police funding right? When we double police funding, murder rates increase, theft increases, etc. So obviously that's not the answer. Police are reactive. Prison abolitions are attempting to be proactive, not reactive.
Man, that was a great debate, fellas. Last year, there was a state in the United States that spent $183 million on police. 183 million. Can anybody guess what state that was? Okay, I'll take that off. It was Kentucky. Kentucky spent $183 million, that state alone. And you know where they ranked out of all the states to include the District of Columbia?
Probably last.
Probably way
51st.
low.
51st. Florida came in at number one. They spent $15 billion on cops. And so this is why we talk about, because in any other, like if this was at your house and you were pouring money on something and it wasn't fixing the problem, we would say, even though this is the way my grandparents did it and my parents did it and I'm used to it, I'm pouring all this money into this and it's not getting the results it's supposed to get. So we should reimagine it. And I think that's the thing. We've spent the money. They talking about, they in the process of creating cop cities and, you know, all of these things that they're doing. And yet they run up in front of us and they say, lawlessness and crime is getting worse, 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 and get us all spun up. Well, if it's so bad, y'all spending all this money on it, then it's got to be something else. The cops ain't fixing it. So why would we continue to pour more money into cops and prisons and all of this stuff? It's just putting money in the pockets of the rich, and it's still leaving us. And when you talk about, I didn't jumped into it, but you know, what other options are there besides police? What would you replace it with? Since that question is up there, I'll jump in, even though I know Kevin's the host, but I'll jump in there with that.
I've already addressed some of it too, but
but
go ahead.
When you think about that, what do affluent people, how do they protect themselves? Not the police, private security. And when you talk about private security, their job ain't to mess with nobody that ain't messing with whatever they securing. Their job is to secure what they securing. How often are cops preventing crime? No, a lot of times they're just there for the show of responding to a crime that has happened. And it's probably a lot of times people that got away with it. You know, it has actually been proven that the Constitution, it went to the Supreme Court and it said that cops are not required to save and protect people. They have the right to walk away. It's not their job. Supreme Court ruled that. So, you know, this idea that we're doing the American thing, we're creating this heroic narrative over some stuff that got a whole nother meaning. And when you reimagine it, you know, again, it's like we talked about, there's other things, but I just keep looking back, like, when you want to reimagine something, you should go look and see where it's working the way that you want it to work. And we can't find examples where having a superabundance of police flooding the area has made neighborhoods, cities, and towns better, you know? So yeah, there are different ways. You know, I really think about like down in Baton Rouge, man, couple of wealthy white folks just got together and decided that they wanted to separate themselves from all the black folks in Baton Rouge. And so they went and they created a town called St. George, and the Louisiana Supreme Court approved them to have their own town, but yet they're going to be using money from the majority black parish of Baton Rouge for all of their services and all of that. And so that was a crime. But when I think about it, Now they want to have their own community policing, and community policing means more than just police that come from that community. It means that it's a protective measure that incorporates the community and includes the community. And can you imagine, I still feel some kind of way if I would ever have to call the cops, because I don't feel like they're going to come and have my best, interests at heart. But it's people in this country that when they call the cops, they really believe that they're public servants there to serve. And we've got to consider that when you got a huge portion of your population that don't feel like the cops are there as public servants to protect and serve, So like, what are the other options? Private security, neighborhoods that have a community investment in the health of the community. And not only do the citizens have invested one, but the budget is invested so that we can have the programs, that we can do the things. Again, like I said, you got people that are innocent that are dying in Rikers, and Rikers is not a prison, it's holding. And people are doing years in Rikers because we got a cash bond system that says it's not about whether you did the worst type of crime. It's if your pocketbook is deep enough, you can get out of there. And people had the nerve to be upset when Illinois said they were going away from cash bonds. But can you imagine me and Kev out one night and we commit the same crime, but because Kevin's pockets is deeper than mine, he go home the next day and I spend 7 months in jail getting treated crazy by crazy folks in there that's in the same way. And I come out like Khalif Browder and can't deal with what I've experienced and kill myself. And all it was about was somebody had deeper pockets, man. Like, so sometimes we just got to look at what we accept as the right system and realize how not right it is,
And to that, I say, if you're going to reimagine something, in order to get to the state that you speak of, then capitalism would have to be reimagined.
Absolutely. That's a huge part of it, Rod. Huge part of it. Huge.
Because that is the driving force behind most of what you see in this country. Love it or lump it, when you see it, it's driven by capitalism.
Yep.
So you would have to reimagine capitalism in order to address a lot of the ills that we experience in society. I mean, just think about it. The Supreme Court, other courts, they're addressing laws that were enacted in the 1800s.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you know how much society has changed from then to now?
Yeah.
It's almost laughable when we think that we're trying to regulate society today, new societal norms today, with laws that were placed on the books in the 1800s.
Yeah.
You talk about historians and constitutional purists and all that. Even the Constitution was written back then.
Yep.
It's like we refuse to recognize that the things have changed. Things continue to change and evolve. And so what else should change and evolve? Should our laws and regulations and policies change and evolve? Or should they just stay the same? Because when they were enacted, it was to address what was going on in society at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we get fast forward to today's environment and we attempt to apply it. And while most of it might be applicable in some shape, form, or fashion, there's a lot of it that might not be.
Yeah.
And so instead of doing something about that, it then becomes about capitalism, big businesses,
Yep. Yep.
with the most expensive lobbyists, with the it's cyclical. It just continues to go around and around. It's like a bobcat chasing his tail. They're never gonna catch because it's a bobcat tail.
You are exactly right. I mean, capitalism is a huge part of it. Nothing about what we've talked about regarding reimagining or any of these changes, the society that we've talked about, seeing come to fruition. None of that can happen without capitalism being reimagined or done away with altogether. Whatever the case is, and I realize that is this something that can happen? Maybe in our lifetime. No, I understand that, but that doesn't mean that as a prison abolitionist, I won't keep working toward whatever it takes to get to that point. But you're exactly right. I mean, capitalism is a huge part of it. As long as capitalism exists as it does today, none of these changes can truly occur. But I love the fact that the youth, are really, really pushing the envelope on some of these things. And so I think incrementally, we've already seen a few changes, and I think that can continue to happen. And eventually, maybe we can get to that state, But something I was going to mention earlier, and I failed to mention was, one of the big arguments that prison abolitionists hear is, well, what about rapists? And there's a lot that can be said about that, right? But one of the things I'll say is that in cases of rape, the current system doesn't work and it hasn't ended the rape culture, right? I mean, research shows that most rapists never even see the inside of a courtroom, right? 2/3 of people who experience sexual violence never even report it to anyone, right? And then the ones who do report it often are dissatisfied with the response that they receive. And then additionally, when you talk about the police officers commit sexual assault at an alarmingly high rate, right? I think about a report that I saw, I think it was from like 2018 or something like that, right? That sexual misconduct was the second most frequently reported form of police misconduct, right? In that same year, there was a report in Buffalo, New York, that showed a police officer was caught for sexual misconduct every 5 days. There was a police officer caught, right, for sexual misconduct, right? So when people envision a world without law enforcement, they envision this world that's as violent as it actually is now, but merely without law enforcement. And that scares them. You see the irony in that, right? But that's because as a society, we've been so indoctrinated with the idea that we solve problems by policing and caging people that many can't imagine anything other than prisons and police as solutions to violence and harm. And that's just not the case at all. What would this country look like if the billions of dollars that go toward prisons and policing, what would it look like if those billions of dollars went toward housing, right? Food, education for all, addiction treatment facilities, all these different things, right? If it went toward all of these things and it was guaranteed for any child born today and their parents within a generation, we wouldn't need prisons. We wouldn't. If all those things were in place within a generation, prisons would be obsolete.
Say is, I was thinking about the judicial system. One of the other reasons people are afraid when you brought up the rapes, people are afraid to bring it up because then certain people can get away with it. The punishment is it's only it seemed like it's hard on one side. It's hard on the black side versus the white side because the first person that popped into my head was Brock Turner when he raped that young lady, and he got a 6-month sentence because the judge didn't want to ruin his life.
The judge said he had long, prosperous life ahead of him.
Right.
Didn't want to ruin his life.
Didn't want to ruin his life. So who in the hell is gonna if that's kind of justice that's gonna be doled out? And you wonder why women don't want to mention that, don't want to bring up the fact that they were raped or they were sexually assaulted. That's why. That's one of the reasons why. And you guys brought it up. You and Rob brought it up about the capitalism. And the moment you try and change it, well, then all of a sudden it's a socialist country. Again, there's a lot of things that can be done, but unfortunately, the powers that be are the ones that are going to be the ones that have to make sure that they push that agenda, and that they're not trying to, because again, the agenda is the ones that's paying, lining their pockets with money.
Look
But
at
that's all.
again, when you look at the demographics in prison, and I'm be quick. Of course, it's Black and brown people. You know, Hispanics make up like 35%, Black and Pookie and Ray Ray, and then we make up like the other 35%. And you just think about how now the opioid is an overdose, right? We've changed the laws that now, if you overdose, you don't go to jail. You know, you get the support you need, right? But what if we had these same laws back in the 80s when crack was available? How many people will be in jail? How many Black and brown people went to jail because they had a little bit of crack? But it was an epidemic then, but you got punished for it. But now we see that because a different demographics of people
There it is,
are
right there.
overdosing. Oh, we need to change the laws. And so, and I'm gonna end with this. Some of the things we need to do, you know, we need to get back to voting to get these folks out of here who make up the laws, who give the police instructions. You know what I'm saying? So let's start with that. Let's vote out some of these people. And Rob mentioned that a lot.
Because you
Let's
sure
vote out some of
can.
these people.
You can vote for your sheriff. You definitely can't
Yeah.
vote for your constable. You can vote. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's vote some of these people out that's making this the issue for people of color.
To be engaged in this reimagined policing or anything else, when you just speak of voting in and of itself, think about the amount of engagement, active engagement that it would require. Therein lies the challenge that we have with reimagining anything.
Mm-hmm.
People don't want to be involved. You know, they want you to do it. They'll reap the benefits of it, but they want you to actually do the work. And you go vote. And you vote for the right person. And then I'll accept who gets in the office because I believe that you're going to do the right thing. Not realizing that it takes all of us to be engaged, to be invested. If you want to reap something out of it, you have to invest in that thing.
And I love the fact that I said it earlier too. I love the fact that the youth, right, that the younger millennials and the Gen Zers are so involved the way that they are. You look and just see what they're doing around the United States, really around the world, quite frankly, on campuses, just regarding Palestine. And that's not the only thing that they're involved in, right? They're involved in some of these things. They're heavily involved in prison abolition and things of that nature. So I think that while things oftentimes look bleak, I think that the younger generation are really making some moves that will change the trajectory of where this country and where the world heads. You know, maybe that's optimistic. I don't know. But from my vantage point, when I'm able to see, that's the way it appears to me. And, you know, so I have hope that we can. Again, I certainly don't see this coming to fruition in our lifetime, but I think it can through it. I really do. And so for that reason, I think it's incumbent upon me, us, whatever, to do the things that's necessary to try to get this world to that point, to try to get this country to a point where we don't need prisons and cops. You know, and again, I know, just like Rod said, right, capitalism is a huge part of it. We have to make changes, huge changes in that. You know, but again, abolition is about investment and love instead of containment and blame. I can't remember who I got that from. I think it may have been Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is just the foremost. She's like the country's leader when it comes to prison abolition. I can't remember if it was her who said it or someone else, but again, abolition is about investment and love, not containment and blame. And if we want to get where we need to be, you know, that's kind of one of the things we have to look at, because quite frankly, you know, prison is not an effective treatment for drug addiction. We need other options. It's not a decent response to mental disability. You know, we need other options. You know, it's a system that leads to the majority of women who have been raped choosing nothing over the available options. You know, it's we need something different. The current system is one that, when it processes juveniles, they have greater than a 90% chance of ending up in prison as an adult, right? And how does that happen? We need other options. We have to have other options in place, and because what we have right now is just not working. So to say that, we need police or we need prisons, no, we don't. Not if we can get this world to a place where other things are important, right? And we're taking care of each other, right? People have resources and the means, right, to live a life. Then no, prisons won't be necessary. Cops won't be necessary, right? And I will continue to argue against anyone who argues that point.
Uh, and I love the fact that, we live in a country where people can, voice their opinions and protest against the things that they don't believe in. And that's great. And so when you talk about reimagining capitalism, or when you think about the institutions that have a hold on this country, yeah, I think when it's counted, young people can do that. They can protest, but if you don't reimagine capitalism, their inability to earn wages to support their livelihood and their causes will be diminished. And unfortunately, it'll be done on purpose. So I get it. And I'm here to hear, what creative solutions the masses can come up with to just address these things, and the saddest part is that we don't have any tolerance for one another. We certainly don't have any tolerance for our differences, our different views, our different religions, our different opinions. It is just that, And if we ever took the time to stop and recognize that this is another human being, let me hear them. Then maybe they'll hear me. And we might find some common ground or recognize that we're not very different at all. But we can't hear where we're alike because of the noise. Whether it's us screaming at one another, whether it's all the noise that's going on around us through the media. And I think it's not until, you take time and really, one, be willing to listen, have an empathetic ear so you can hear, and then recognize, what? Yeah, we got these 100 items and we only agree on 2 of them. Okay, how can we push that forward?
Right.
That's a start, right? So, but it takes that, and it takes a level of engagement that unfortunately we don't see a lot of. What we do see is when I disagree with your position and I have the political clout and financial backing, I'll call it wokeness, and then we'll just start banning stuff that we don't agree with.
And Rob, what's funny is before you said that, the first thing that popped into my head is somebody will call you radical for the way you're thinking and the way you're talking right now. That's radicalized talking. That's what they would call it nowadays. But then you came out with wokeness. You hit the nail on the head, bro.
It's just human decency towards one another. That's all it is. And, people can try to place any word or any narrative on what you believe if they want. That's on them, right? So, but that's what the institutions allow to take place, and then they sell it to the masses through fear that, oh, this great life you've been able to create for yourself is going to all vanish if you allow the truth about our history to come to the forefront or be placed in books. It's crazy, 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 crazy.
Well, we love to get your thoughts, you as our viewers, any thoughts you have on what we've discussed here. I know we've gone for a while, so, and I think we dug deep into this thing. So any thoughts that you all have, please share them with us, and we can address them on the next episode. So with that, we want to thank each of you for taking the time to join us as we wrap up this week's episode. We want to leave you with a quote from an unknown author who said, "If we don't reimagine our reality, we are doomed to live in the reality created by those in power." Until next time, peace.